All right, how's everybody doing? Our last week of class. Hopefully, you all saw that list I put up last week of important dates. Essentially, your reading responses are all due Friday. Your papers due the 7th, and then your final will be the 12th. I will have that up before the date of the final, so you'll have days to take it. Hopefully, I'll have it up Thursday. So you'll have a while to get that done, kind of at your own leisure. But Natasha Trethewey. So the last poet we're going to look at, um, one of the most important modern American writers, particularly Southern ones. Um, so we're going to look at three pieces by her. We're going to look at Vignette, the photograph Ice Storm, and Graveyard Blues. Um, Now, the important thing to consider when reading all of Trethewey's work is how she deals with history, right? How she approaches personal history, how her personal history, how she approaches our national history, be that on a larger scale, um, involving race, the treatment of women, etc. Because she's doing a lot of very beautiful, very interesting, and cool things. And we'll talk about when we get to Graveyard Blues how she's kind of melding past forms with quintessentially American forms. But that's going to be the last piece we're going to look at. First, we're going to look at Vignette. So, this is Belloc's, well, it is not the exact picture that she's talking about. It's the same woman. Um, the real difference is just that she's sitting down in the one that Trethewey is discussing, but same look on her face and everything. I don't know. I couldn't find one that wasn't smaller than a thumbnail of that piece, but this is the woman. So all of these photographs come from a collection, the turn of last century, of sex workers in New Orleans, where it was legal at the time. It's worth checking out. It's called Storyville. You can find, if you just Google search Belloc and Storyville, you'll get a ton of different photographs from it. There's nudity in there, but this woman in particular stands out from everybody else, right? Most of the rest of them are just kind of in what they happen to be in at the time. And, that's not always fully clothed. But we get the impression from this portrait and also from the poem that this is, this person dressed up, right? Which is very important to the piece itself. Now, read it quickly and then we will hop into it. There is a fair amount of other things to discuss aside just from what is in there, but they pose the portrait outside the brothel. Belloc's black scrim, a chair for her to sit on. She wears white, a rhinestone choker, fur, her dark crown of hair an elegant image she might send to her mother. Perhaps the others crowd in behind Belloc, awaiting their turns, tremors of laughter in their white throats. Maybe Belloc chats just a little to put her at ease while he waits for the right moment, a look on her face to keep in a gilded frame. The ornate box he'll put her in. Suppose he tells her about a circus coming to town, monkeys, and organ music, the high trapeze, but then she's no longer listening. She's forgotten he's there. Instead, she must be thinking of her childhood, wonder at seeing the contortionist in a sideshow, how he could make himself small, fit into cramped spaces, his lungs barely expanding with each tiny breath. She thinks of her own shallow breath, her back straining, the stays of a bustier, the weight of a body pressing down on her. Picture her face now as she realizes that it must have been harder every year, that the contortionist too must have ached each night in his tent. This is how Belloc takes her, her brow furrowed as she looks out to the left, past all of them. Imagine her a moment later, after the flash, blinded, stepping out of the frame, wide-eyed into her life. So, before we jump into the poem, we need to talk about the word vignette, and we need to talk about ekphrases, or ekphrastic poetry. So, first off, ekphrases or ekphrastic poems are pieces or poems that describe a visual piece of art, right? So the term comes from the Greek word ekphrases, which means description, and ekphrastic poems can be about real or imaginary visual art, and they often tell a new story or amplify the meaning of the already existing artwork. One of the most classically famous examples of an ekphrastic poem is Ode to a Grecian Urn by John Keats, right? I mean, he was in a museum and saw a Grecian urn, and if you've never seen a Grecian urn before, you know, as you go around it, it will tell a story, right? And it'll have images on there and drawings. So that's one of the most famous, I mean, modern in the sense of like thousands of years of writing. It's a couple hundred years old at this point. But one of the most kind of classically well-known ekphrastic poems would be Ode to a Grecian Urn by John Keats. But we're not talking about John Keats. We're talking about Natasha Trethewey. So this is an ekphrastic poem, right? Because she's describing this photograph. And then we'll see that photograph Ice Storm in 1971 is also an ekphrastic poem, but in a very different and more personal manner. Vignette has two meanings, which both perfectly apply to this poem. A vignette, in terms of literature, is a short descriptive passage that captures a moment in time and is usually written in free verse, which is exactly what this piece does. Also, vignettes are a literary device that writers use to explore a character, concept, or place in greater detail, or to shed light on something that wouldn't be visible. Again, that's what's happening here. And if you think also about the end of that definition, right, to shed light on something that wouldn't be visible, we can take that literally and figuratively with this piece, right, because it not only is a portrait of this sex worker, it is also about a photographer taking a photograph, right, and at the end of it, right, she's dazed, walking out into her life, but she's kind of dazed and stunned by the flash. And if you think of this, like, you know, not a regular camera flash, but one of those giant old, you know, photography flashes that will kind of blind you. But a vignette also is a small illustration or portrait photograph which fades into its background without a definite border, right? So it's kind of dark around the edges, and that can be a stylistic choice. And it can also just be from fault of an old, you know, camera. So works perfectly in both ways, definition-wise. So, my first question for you involves this yellow and pink highlight, right? So she wears white, a rhinestone choker, fur, her dark crown of hair, an elegant image, one she might send to her mother, right? Which is then juxtaposed with this pink highlight, right? Perhaps the others crowd in behind Belloc, awaiting their turns, tremors of laughter in their white throats. These are two very kind of juxtaposing images and ideas, right? So we have our subject that has dressed up, right? She has on fur, she's in a rhinestone choker. She is, prepared herself for this portrait. Um, and again, if you do check out some of the other photographs from Storyville, um, she's the only person that does this, right? A lot of the other subjects are, just kind of half clothed or in their underwear, just like smoking cigarettes and stuff. Um, and this is the most kind of classical portrait in the whole piece. So, we have this sense that this particular subject um, is taking a little bit more pride in these photographs, right? Um, Maybe it's not just something to make some money off of, it's something to be proud of, right? So she dresses up for it, right, in the sense that it would be something that you might send to your mother, right? Which is then juxtaposed by everyone else tremoring with laughter behind her, right? So maybe this fact or the idea that she's taking pride in herself and in her work and her life that she has put together for her, um, you know, seems laughable to the rest of everyone in this brothel. Um, and, in a lot of ways, especially here in the United States, the idea of taking pride in being a sex worker generally would be looked down upon, right? But I mean, it's a legal, respectable profession in many other parts of the world. So, kind of something to consider while we go through this piece. Um, but then we kind of move from that setup here, right? And then, we have the idea that the photographer is just kind of chatting up his subjects, putting them at ease to snap the photograph, right? Waiting for the right moment that he wants to catch. But then we have this line, a look on her face to keep in a gilded frame. Sure, it's a photograph. The ornate box he'll put her in. So this idea of being stuffed away in a box um, obviously applies to the contortionist, and then we have the metaphor that we'll talk about at the end. But that's our first bit of box imagery, right? Um, and then he's putting her at ease, telling her about the circus, right? Which sparks a memory for the subject of this piece, right? And she's thinking about a contortionist, that she saw at a sideshow as a kid. And it's obviously something that she relates to, right? How he could make himself small, fit into cramped spaces, his lungs barely expanding with each tiny breath. She thinks of her own shallow breath, her back straining the stays of a bustier, the white weight of a body pressing down on her. So, she's making this comparison that she lives a similar life to this contortionist, right? That is cramped and stuffed into things, right? Obviously, he's stuffed into a tiny little box or what have you, or knotted up. And that comparison with her is, being in a bustier, right? That, has her not really being able to breathe naturally or normally, and then also the fact that, being kind of suffocated by someone on top of you because she is a sex worker and she, you know, empathizes, sympathizes, and also relates to this contortionist for all of these reasons. Um, but then we have our ending, right? Picture her face now as she realizes that it must have been harder every year, that the contortionist too must have ached each night in his tent. This is how Belloc takes her brow furrowed as she looks out to the left past all of them. Imagine her a moment later, after the flash, blinded, stepping out of the frame, wide-eyed into her life. Now this is where the piece really, this is where the themes of the piece really kind of come to light, right? If we think to the beginning, where we have our subject that has dressed up for this portrait, unlike everybody else, right? There's a sense of pride there that she's made this life for herself, even if it's a life that is hard and a lot of people look down upon or, you know, don't understand. But she takes pride in that, and she takes pride in herself, even though she feels like a contortionist in a sideshow, right? Now we can take the whole contortionist metaphor that we just discussed and kind of being suffocated, but we can also think about the idea of the contortionist being in a sideshow, and you know, maybe this isn't how this woman feels about herself, but it definitely could be how others feel about her, right? This brothel kind of being a sideshow, people kind of on the fringe of society that, you know, are there for people's entertainment, literally, in one way or another. And, you know, also the fact that, you know, they're getting their portraits taken for that reason. But there is this sense of pride, excuse me, that runs through the whole piece. And that's really what we get at the end with her blinded, stepping out of the frame, wide-eyed into her life. Now, wide-eyed here is another spot where we can take something in two different ways. There are a lot of dual meanings throughout this piece, right? We have the title, vignette, you know, a vignette being a portrait, a type of poem, and then also kind of a border on a photograph. We have the end here, right? Stepping out of the frame wide-eyed into her life, right? Wide-eyed, one, you know, sure, she's just been blinded by this flash, but that's not the important reason why she's stepping out wide-eyed into her life, right? So like our note here says, the ultimate transcendence of Trethewey's collective Storyville character is recorded in the final stanza of the final poem, Vignette, right? The subject is said to look out to the left past all of them, and after the instance of the photograph being taken in this particular moment, she steps out of the frame, wide-eyed into her life. She is wide-eyed with excitement for the possibilities of a self-determined, though hard, life or existence, right? Very much so like the contortionist. It's why she, you know, relates to him. You know, there are more poems in this collection about portraits of other sex workers from this Storyville photography collection, right? And it makes sense that this is the last one in Trethewey's collection, right? That the last person that she's going to write a poem about is the one that takes pride in herself, right? Is self-determined, you know, is willing to work as hard as they have to really, you know, live one's own life, you know, be able to take care of oneself. So why not take pride in that work, even if it is hard and it is daunting, right? So that's really what this piece is all about. But there is the question of history here as well, right? That's one of the first things that I said was how does Trethewey work with history, be it personal or non-personal? And this being a non-personal piece, especially considering the next two that we're going to look at are personal in regards to Trethewey's history. You know, why do you think that Trethewey chose to, write a collection about a collection of photographs of sex workers in New Orleans? I think is something to ponder. You know, is it giving a excuse me, giving a voice to the voiceless again, right? Because I mean, maybe there is obviously something voyeuristic and perhaps, taking advantage of in one way or another, even if these sex workers are getting paid for the initial photographs, they're photographs, right? There's no, I mean, obviously there are stories told throughout visual art, but what Trethewey is doing here is giving these women even more, excuse me, of a voice, right? And roughly 100 years later, again, right? So, I think what Trethewey is doing in this particular collection in terms of history is giving a voice to the voiceless, right? Even though I think it's easy for us to imagine that at least this particular portrait subject probably is not a voiceless individual, or was rather. So, again, something to consider when discussing history on a larger, non-personal scale. So, we're going to look at photograph Ice Storm 1971, and then we're going to wrap it up with Graveyard Blues. So, photograph Ice Storm 1971 is also an ekphrastic poem, but it is different in many ways than Vignette, which we will discuss once we read it. But it's also important to note that the Trethewey poems included in this anthology all center on questions of history and memory, whether personal, cultural, or national. Specifically, as the daughter of an African American mother and white father, Trethewey has allowed her multiracial heritage to inform her meditations on foundational moments in national memory, and those moments appear when refracted through issues of race, which is just something to consider, even though this poem involves a stepfather and not her actual father. So let's read it, and then we'll discuss this whole ekphrastic concept once again. Why the rough edge of beauty? Why the tired face of a woman suffering made luminous by the camera's eye? Or the storm that drives us inside for days, power lines down, food rotting in the refrigerator, while outside the landscape glistens beneath a glaze of ice? Why remember anything but wonder of those days? The iced trees, each leaf in its glassy case. The picture we took that first morning, the front yard, a beautiful, strange place. Why on the back has someone made a list of our names, the date, the event? Nothing of what's inside. Mother, stepfather's fist. Now, in terms of this being an ekphrastic poem, the main difference, two main differences between this and Vignette is one, this is a personal poem, for Trethewey, right? It is an ekphrastic poem about a personal photograph from her childhood, unlike Vignette. And we don't have the luxury of seeing this photograph, right? And I think that also is a major difference in terms of us um, reading it, analyzing it, thinking about it, discussing it as readers, right? Um, so it makes sense in a lot of ways. You know, it's more personal. Why show the photograph at all? The only reason that we have the vignette photograph is because we can find it, right? Um, Now, the other important thing to consider, um, this poem is nothing but questions, right? Yes, obviously there are descriptions of this ice storm, um, and there's the juxtaposition of its beauty, right, um, alongside the horrors of the inside of this house that this family's stuck in for days, right, which makes it even more horrible. There's no escape, and even though there's this winter wonderland outside, um, it's anything but that for this family, right, because of this abusive stepfather. So the fact that this is all questions is something to consider, right? Especially in terms of when thinking about Trethewey discussing or being willing to describe her personal history, right? Um, it's something we can all relate to. You know, we can all look back. I mean, in terms of questioning, our personal histories, decisions, circumstances, right? Why would I do that? Why didn't I do this? Why did this happen to me and not other people? Um, you know, our life, our lives are wrought with questions, right? And usually questions without answers. And I think that that is what this poem is about in a lot of ways, right? We start with why the rough edge of beauty, why the tired face of a woman suffering, right? We get a description of this storm that has locked this family inside, even though it's beautiful outside. There are these horrors inside. Um, why no description of the actual weekend on the back of the photograph, right? That's kind of our final stanza. Why on the back has someone made a list of our names, the date, the event, nothing of what's inside, right? So there's this idea too of this photograph being superficial, right? If it almost that it's a lie in a lot of ways, right? Because all that it says on the back is photographed as Ice Storm 1971, right? And then everybody's names, which doesn't do justice to the reality of that week, right? And the horrors of that week personally for Trethewey and her family. So, um, in terms of rhyme scheme, this is pretty interesting, right? So why suffering I in our first tercet, right? Remember, 3-line stanza. Inside, rotting, outside, glaze, anything days, case, morning, place, list, nothing, fist. So our first and third lines in each stanza. Why I, right? Inside, outside, that's a lot of slant rhyme, but that is a rhyme. Glaze, days, case, place, list, fist, right? So we have that rhyme there. And then our second line, right? We have suffering, rotting, anything, morning, nothing, right? That nothing, again, is kind of a stretch of slant rhyme, but it is there. So there is a lot of slant rhyme going on in this piece. And remember, slant rhyme is a stretch, but slant rhyme is also skewed, right? It's not perfect. Um, and, I think it's important to consider the power and the purpose and the intentionality of rhyme in poems. Um, we've discussed how if if something is formal enough and then it breaks that form, that's kind of a hint to maybe where one of the major themes is occurring, or a turn, which we will discuss in our next piece. Um, but this is all slanted. This rhyme's all slanted and skewed, right? Very much so like um, the history that this photograph has created, right? Remember, just everyone's names, Ice Storm 1971. But this poem illuminates, right, that kind of skewed reality of the photograph, um, and allows us to step into Trethewey's personal history and her mind, and really, be exposed to those horrors. So another way that she is working with history, right, albeit personal. So the last poem that we will look at this semester is Graveyard Blues. I posted a video of her reading it, so we might as well just pull it up.
Graveyard Blues. It rained the whole time we were laying her down, rained from church to grave when we put her down. The suck of mud at our feet was a hollow sound. When the preacher called out, I held up my hand. When he called for a witness, I raised my hand. Death stops the body's work, the soul's a journeyman. The sun came out when I turned to walk away, glared down on me as I turned and walked away, my back to my mother, leaving her where she lay. The road going home was pocked with holes, that home-going road's always full of holes. Though we slow down, time's wheel still rolls. I wander now among names of the dead, my mother's name, stone pillow for my head.
So this, I think, in terms of relating history, right, literary history, um, literary formalities and structure and normalcies into some form of modernity, and something quintessentially American. Um, this is the poem in this whole anthology, in my opinion, that does that the best, right? So we've looked at a handful of sonnets this semester, right? Um, this is a very distorted sonnet, right? And what distorts it also makes it quintessentially, well, its distortion makes it quintessentially modern or postmodern, but how it is distorted makes it quintessentially American, right? Um, so it is based off a Shakespearean sonnet. And just to remind you, remember you would have an A B A B C D C D E F E F G G rhyme scheme, right? Now, this is obviously not what's happening here. This has the final couplet, right? A rhyming two-line stanza that a sonnet would, but look how our other stanzas are broken down, right? One, they're not quatrains. They're not 4-line stanzas. They're tercets. They're 3-line stanzas. Sorry about all the playground kids in the background. Now, what makes this quintessentially American and quintessentially modern is that what Trethewey does here is she takes the Shakespearean sonnet, right? One of the most, or at least used to be, slammed in your head poetic forms in high school, at the very least, that there is, right? Now, if we take, a form that has a lot of history behind it, Shakespearean sonnets in particular, but also Italian sonnets, Petrarchan sonnets, over 50% of the time, probably 75% of the time, sonnets are usually love poems, right? Now, that's something to consider. We can consider the idea that this is a love poem in a way, right? It's a farewell to her mother. It's also an elegy, right? A poem of serious reflection, normally a lament for the dead. We've looked at a ton of elegies. The first poem we looked at, I believe, was an elegy, or at least our first class with Dickinson. Right? So we have the importance of the sonnet, right? A love poem. We have the importance of the elegy that we've looked at countless times throughout the semester. So we have an elegiac sonnet, but what makes it quintessentially American and what makes this poem really cool is that it's also based off of the blues, right? Obviously, it's called Graveyard Blues, so we get that. We have Trethewey's personal history and connection with the blues as a Black Southern person, and the blues, hence their name, is a way to, pull yourself out of whatever pain you are in. We have a lot of structural things going on here that are reminiscent of classic 12-bar blues songs. Tons of repetition, right? Rained, rained, down, down, sound, hand, hand, man, away, away, lay, holes, holes, rolls, dead, head, right? We have this kind of interesting inversion here. The road going home was pocked with holes. The home going road, so road going home going road, is a very interesting, beautiful kind of inversion. And if you listen to any blues music or read any blues lyrics, especially older original blues, like Robert Johnson, Blind, Willie McTeal, etc., right? There's a lot of those language inversions going on in the lines. We have the idea, I did not highlight it. Where is it? Death stops the body's work, the soul's a journeyman, right? A journeyman being another name for a traveling musician, but originally a traveling blues musician in terms of historical context. So what Trethewey is doing here, and we'll talk about this final couplet in a second, is combining the old with the new, right? She's taking something, the sonnet, that is supposed to be kind of known within the literary and academic world and the poetic world, right? And is so universal, and then is taking the blues, which arguably is not, right? At least not originally, and combining them, right? To excuse me, to make it something quintessentially American, right? So if we think about, I mean, how do we say what's quintessentially American? It's always been an impossible statement um, to consider, to rectify, to deal with, considering, how different everyone's existence in this country really is. But the blues is quintessentially American, right? Um, so that's something to truly consider. And also the beauty of her, combining the old with the new and making something totally different, right? Um, is really a feat of literature, right? Um, and as we've seen through this whole semester, we started, we really, this goes all the way back to Dickinson, right? Ow, what? Sorry, this goes all the way back to Dickinson, right? Remember, Dickinson's um, work was kind of shunted aside because she was breaking form and creating something new, right? She was creating something quintessentially American. But considering when she was writing, she was just disregarded because she was a woman. We see Walt Whitman kind of champion free verse, right? Breaking all forms, um, you know, structurally, classically. I mean, we can talk about then the influence of Whitman on Ginsberg and Hughes, um, and them kind of telling their truths and telling their stories. Um, but then I think that all really kind of leads to this, right? Something that wouldn't exist if America didn't exist. If the blues didn't exist, this poem wouldn't exist. Um, so, I don't know. I think it is uh, the best poem for us to end on for the semester. Um, I will have a shorter video up about Art Spiegelman and Mouse later today or tomorrow morning. But I think this is a great kind of encompass of in American literature class, right? To see how far we've come, how innovative we've been within the arts. Um, so